It's amazing how many paths lead back to Sagert House, to the Mansfield family home, in so many varied stories that we write about and that end up national news. I mean, for example, the Criminal Assets Bureau case against Daniel Kinahan and Thomas Bomber Kavanagh, which led all the way back to €4.5 million in cash being delivered to that house, to Sagert House, out in Sagert. Now, anyone who doesn't know it, it's a big mansion that's just beside the entrance to City West Hotel. I know it well because I've spent quite a lot of time mooching around out there over the years on different stories. But only in the last couple of weeks, Nathan Kinsella, former Real IRA man, has pleaded guilty to tax offences, and they relate to monies basically that he seems to have gathered into Sagert House. Now, why was Nathan Kinsella in the Mansfield family mansion? And of course that relates back to other individuals like Desi O'Hare, like Whacker Duffy, like all these various paramilitaries that at one point all gathered there because Jimmy Mansfield Jr. sort of opened the doors of that family home and let them all in because there was an absolute, I'm going to just say the word, a clusterfuck going on.
Yeah, he did, isn't it? He swallowed a spider to catch a fly.
Exactly. How beautifully put.
Yes.
Did you write that?
I didn't, Nicola. I didn't. I'll take credit for it though.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it used to sound like a crime reporter's fantasy land stuff, didn't it? When people used to talk about it.
Actually, you could have it as a kind of like, a kind of a fun park.
Yeah, because, you always heard these stories about the Mansfields and, Bomber Kavanagh's there and the Kinahans are there and then all the IRA guys are there and then other, burglary gang guys are there and they're all in the middle with this socialite at the centre. And it just sounded like it's one of those stories that it's never going to see the light of day.
Go back further, you'd Lee Cullen, you'd all these. I mean, we were constantly out around City West in surveillance vehicles with cameras. We pictured Daniel Kinahan there, Christopher Kinahan Jr., Liam Rowe. Yeah. We pictured so many of them. I'd say if you went through our archives, and you looked at the background of where any of these photographs are, there would be so many from out around to Sagert House and City West.
And it just seemed like such an unlikely conglomeration of things. But obviously it's now all public knowledge, which is amazing, really, isn't it? There was always these rumours, and I always believed, look, nobody's ever going to be able to print that. But time did catch up with them.
Time eventually caught up with them, and I understand there's still investigations going on around what went on out there over a period of time, and to do with all sorts of, VAT scams and money laundering and all the rest of this. But for the moment, let's have a little look at Nathan Kinsella.
Yeah.
Start with a bit of background, because I think you would know more about that background, the Real IRA and Alan Ryan and him.
Yeah, he was one of when we started writing about Alan Ryan, he was obviously came into prominence in Dublin because he was putting the heavy on drug dealers, really. And it was really unprecedented at the time because
when was this? Sort of the 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10?
Probably a bit later, yeah.
He was murdered, I think, in 2011.
Yeah, so it was probably the 2 years running up to that.
Sorry, 1 second.
2012.
He was murdered, I think, in 2012.
Yeah, so Alan Ryan had spent a short period of time in Portlaoise after he was caught in with IRA arms, basically.
That's when he was quite young.
And he'd come out of that, after that prison sentence, had become involved in, doing security for places. And he built up this young cohort of guys around him over a period of time. They all drank together. They all were seen in pubs together, and they started putting the heavy on drug dealers. Now, initially, they were kind of scorned to a degree. They weren't taken too seriously.
Can I ask you something? And you mightn't be able to answer this, but it just occurs to me. Did they somehow join the Real IRA, or did they become the Real IRA in Dublin? Did they?
No,
were they always, was Ryan and that from a very Republican background?
He was from a Republican background, but not a particularly background involved with the Provos. He joined the Na Fianna, the youth wing of the IRA as a teenager, under 18. He had come from a Republican background, but he was right in there. I mean, these guys are peacetime soldiers, as they could be called. I mean, they joined post-ceasefire when the Real IRA were really not up to much in terms of,
Their power base, the Real IRA, was in the north. So this was some sort of a Dublin faction of it.
Well, it was the Dublin Brigade, I suppose, is what it became known as. But the IRA, by its nature, obviously the Provos were quite organised, but also quite disorganised at times, and sometimes because you can't have meetings and AGMs and take notes and all of that, sometimes there's different wings can act sort of semi-autonomously, although they're answerable. Certainly after the ceasefire and after the Provos started to disband, the Real IRA were even more chaotic. Now they had a presence in Ireland, or in the 26 counties. They had quite a strong presence in Cork, for example. They had a much lesser presence in Limerick. There was other dissident groups there, and they had
continuity were strong there.
Yeah, exactly. And they certainly had membership in Dublin and across Louth and Meath, but they weren't regarded as being particularly active. If you look back into 2000, some of the operations that were being carried out by the Real IRA from involving Dublin people were kind of almost student-y types, who've been recruited in UCD and places like that. So Alan Ryan, when he came out of prison, he was obviously in there with a group of some younger Real IRA guys. He come out, and what I told was that he was motivated by this sense that the Real IRA were being treated as a joke in Dublin, in the communities that they mostly came from, the working class communities in the north side in particular, that they weren't being taken seriously by the drug gangs who had become much better armed, much better resourced than they had. So when he came out, he was doing security, and at that point he started coming in conflict with a number of organisations, including the Hutch associates of the Hutch, well, what we would now call the Hutch gang, maybe not Gerard Hutch himself, but people very close to him. There've been a number of incidents with a well-known member of the Hutch gang who's currently facing charges, who we can't name, and then he become in conflict with other groupings as well. At some point along the way, he started to attract a mass of these young guys, and some of them less young. He was being mentored by maybe older figures in the background.
He would have been about 30, is that right, at this point you're talking about?
Yeah, something in or around that.
So you're talking about 2007 to 2009-10.
Yeah, that sort of time. And I suppose around 2009, he'd become involved in a few sort of relatively localised disputes. There'd been a number of incidents. And I think what these incidents probably made them more attractive to certain young people. There was also a couple of people from the north who'd had to leave for various reasons that had become associated with him. And they started really, really putting the heavy on drug dealers. I mean, it was, it really caused a lot of, shock, I think, because they were willing to shoot people. They certainly were willing to torture people. There was people, a very well-known criminal had a couple of fingers chopped off in Fairview Park at one stage because he wouldn't pay up. They were targeting very serious criminals as well.
And Nathan Kinsella was one of these, one of Alan Ryan's associates.
Yeah, so at this time, Alan Ryan, they were doing this, shooting drug dealers, threatening them. But you'd also see them then on a Saturday marching with the Republicans at the GPO with the student types, for want of a better word. And with him at all these times, both as he did the security and both as he went on these marches, you would see Nathan Kinsella with him. He was one of those people almost surgically attached to Alan Ryan.
Would he have been his right-hand man?
Well, something like that. I mean, there was a core group of them, maybe 5 or 6 of them, and Nathan Kinsella was one of them.
Vinnie Ryan, Alan Ryan's brother, would have been another one?
Yeah, Decky Smith, who was ultimately shot dead, who was originally from the north. So, and there was another couple of guys as well who are still floating around. But Nathan Kinsella was originally from the north inner city. He would have been one of the people who were putting the heavy on the drug dealers, basically. He would have had a Republican pedigree. And what happened was, it's always going to be a bit murky. Is it the murder of Alan Ryan? He was certainly shot dead by a North Dublin gang. It is quite well believed, and we believe it as well, that was at least partly organised by a criminal known as Mr. Big. It seems that he was given the nod by some people in the north who felt Alan Ryan was either not handing up money, was becoming too powerful. They didn't like him. When I mean people in the north, I mean people in his own organisation who certainly didn't help plan the murder, but said if it's carried out, there'd be very little retaliation. Once Alan Ryan was shot dead, Alan Ryan had become probably the most feared figure in Dublin's criminal underworld for that period of time. I mean, he'd certainly been heavily involved in the murder of somebody like Mick Kelly, who'd been dated, also known as the Panda, who they'd attempted to extort money from and who had refused. He was shot dead. That sort of thing shot fear into the criminals, because they weren't, Mick Kelly was a very, very well connected, serious player. So after Alan Ryan's murder, if you remember at the time, there was an atmosphere that this is going to cause absolute carnage on the streets of Dublin, that you can't do that. Somebody in the Real IRA cannot be shot by a criminal. It's absolutely beyond the pale. But very quickly, a couple of things happened. First, there was Alan Ryan's funeral. His coffin was in a front garden and there were shots fired over it, and pictures were taken and put on social media. It caused outrage because he then had a full colour party funeral. While a lot of what Alan Ryan had done hadn't really sparked a lot of interest in the papers, certainly that sparked outrage in normal society.
And in the Dáil.
And in the Dáil. And as you know, when those things spark outrage in the Dáil, there's action taken. And then also, what happened was a couple of Alan Ryan's associates received punishment shootings, one of whom was Nathan Kinsella. The other was a guy called Decky Smith, who was ultimately shot dead, not by the IRA. But Nathan Kinsella was...
He was kneecapped.
He was kneecapped, and he was booted out of the IRA, or whatever that means. He was certainly... disassociated from them for a period of time. He also became a central focus regarding the Colour Party for a Garda investigation into membership of the IRA, and he'd ultimately was found guilty of membership in the aftermath of Alan Ryan's shooting and sentenced to 2 years in prison. During his time in prison, he actually didn't go to Portlaoise. He went to another wing in I think it was the Midlands. Could be wrong about that, but he certainly, was semi-excommunicated at that stage. So that was the background of him. Then he did he disappear? Certainly. Well,
before you get on to that, I'm going to give you another side of the background that was happening. And we opened this by saying all paths lead back to Sagert House, the Mansfield family home. So back to the same period that you've been talking about there, when Alan Ryan has emerged as this leading figure of the Real IRA. He's built up a band of brothers. They're extorting drug dealers. You have the cocaine boom going on in the background, by the way, so people have a lot of money. You had two things. You had, first of all, Ryan looked to extort some money from Eamon Kelly, who was the sort of the godfather of godfathers in Ireland at the time, and who was mentoring a lot of very violent and serious criminals, and who had the ear of Christy Kinahan Sr. in Spain, the Netherlands, wherever he was at that stage. So anything that needed to be sanctioned could be sanctioned through him. Eamon Kelly, who was a veteran provo himself and very friendly with Desi O'Hare, looked for some advice on what to do. That he's been, he couldn't believe that he had been asked for money from this young sort of gang as such. And Desi O'Hare told him, don't pay up. and tell all your people, anyone you're mentoring, don't pay up. You show any weakness, they come back for more. So Kelly held his ground, of course, but felt under threat. So that's going on one side of things. And of course, Kelly is shot sometimes later by a kind of like a little blasting of a dying wasp from what happens following the murder of Alan Ryan. But while they're extorting money from all these criminals and causing all that chaos, they're also knocking around with Jim Mansfield Jr., who has his own problems. His father is still alive, Jim Mansfield Sr., the once richest man in the country, who in 2009 got into a bit of bother because he had overstretched himself in the property market like many others. And the banks came looking for their 200 plus million that he owed. Receivers were appointed. He lost his assets like City West and Finstown House Hotel. It all got sort of swept up by these receivers. And at the same time, Jim Mansfield Sr., as the rumours suggested, and now we know factually, had been sort of offering a money laundering service to criminals and paramilitaries. And at some point in 2009, his son, Jimmy Jr., had accepted this money, 4.5 million, from Daniel Kinahan and Thomas Bomber Kavanagh. And the reason they gave it to him was so as he would invest it in the property empire. So the money was taken, but it actually, none of the properties were signed over before everything washed into the receivership. So there was chaos.
Yeah.
And of course, Jim Mansfield Sr. got sick and he tried to develop a plan to claw back what he could of his assets. He identified Paddy Riley's field, Finstown House Hotel, and a third piece that he wanted back was some of the properties actually that had been promised to the likes of the Kinahans and probably other criminals as well. And he sort of brought in investors, sort of associates of his, to try and do a deal with the receivers to buy it back. The plan was they'd buy it back, hold it for the Mansfields until they could raise the funds, and they'd sort of start again. But of course, Mansfield was getting sicker and sicker. His son probably didn't have the ability to keep everyone happy the way his father did. And he found himself in serious bother because all these criminals who'd invested were coming looking for money, and they were coming and threatening him. So what he did was he brought in a couple of paramilitaries to protect him. And then he brought in another crowd of paramilitaries to cast aside the first ones he'd brought in. And he ended up basically inviting them all in, and they all started infighting. Now, during a trial recently in the Special Criminal Court, when Mansfield Jr. was up for kidnapping charges, was found not guilty for that, but found guilty for attempting to pervert the course of justice, incredible evidence was heard, which is all around this time. And part of the evidence was that Alan Ryan was on the payroll, the Mansfield payroll, that at one point Jimmy Jr. was paying the Real IRA under Alan Ryan €2,500 per week to protect him from what was described in court as the Wall organised crime group and the Kavanaghs, which we later discovered was the Bomber Kavanagh organisation, because they had invested this money that had gone to the receivers. But Junior, according to evidence given in the court, wanted to go to the funeral of Alan Ryan.
Yeah.
He felt quite close to him, and he was advised against it because it wouldn't have looked the best. But in the aftermath of Ryan's shooting, Nathan Kinsella pretty much moved into Tasaggart. He moved in. It was described how he was using it as his office.
Yeah.
He was sometimes on the run, I think, going into hiding, and, in the aftermath, obviously, he had been injured by the kneecapping. But it's just extraordinary, the meeting of those worlds, the collision of all those worlds, that high society, the millionaire business, the richest family in Ireland, and the paramilitaries and the drug dealers, and everybody came together.
Yeah. I mean, we have a great picture, of course, of Jim Mansfield Jr. and Nathan Kinsella at Mondello race track, don't we?
Yeah.
Which is
that was a family occasion. That was Samuel Mansfield, who's Jimmy Jr.'s son. It was his first outing on a racetrack. He seems to be an avid car enthusiast, and he was racing that day. And it was a family event. And Nathan Kinsella is standing there on the balcony with Jimmy Jr.
Yeah. And then, of course, he ends up in Blackrock.
He ends up in Blackrock, in a house near Newtown Park Avenue. a house that was purchased and was in the name of a builder called Jerry McGreevy, who was one of the investors brought in at the time by Mansfields to buy back, in particular, Paddy Riley's field, seen as the jewel in the crown. And it all went sour because those investors came in and there was deadlines put on how long they would hold those investments for. And if the Mansfields couldn't raise the funds to buy them back, then they were theirs. I mean, these investors didn't come in at no risk whatsoever. Anyway, the Jimmy Jr. missed a lot of deadlines and things went sour with them. And some of those paramilitaries were putting the heavy on the builder, Jerry McGreevy and others, to force them to sign back those assets to the Mansfield estate. Jerry McGreevy buys this house on Newtown Park Avenue, which is like €1 million plus home, 6 beds, 4-bath home. One of the best addresses, I would say, on the south side of Dublin. And who moved into it but Nathan Kinsella and his new partner, Jennifer Dunne.
No doubt horrifying the neighbours in Blackrock. Horrifying
them, Niall.
Yes.
And they discovered who he was. Now, apparently very quiet neighbours, actually, Kinsella and Jennifer Dunne. Jennifer Dunne, who was a previous employee in the Mansfield
administration employee, was it in Mansfield, one of the Mansfield organisations? And
met Nathan Kinsella when he was knocking around, at Tasaggart House. But interestingly, so the two of them in February 2023, so this house up on off Newtown Park Avenue was actually raided in April 2020. And that shocked the neighbours, I can tell you.
Good Lord.
Yeah. Anyway, the house was raided, and what happened, in the meantime, has been this investigation into money laundering offences. And in February of this year, both Jennifer Dunne and Nathan Kinsella appeared in court charged with these money laundering offences. And there was 6 money laundering offences charges relating to bank accounts where funds were lodged in 2018, in 2019. And both, certainly one of them, gave their address to the court as to Sagert House, the Mansfield family home, right?
Yeah.
And only this week, or in the last weeks, Kinsella they've dropped the money laundering charges.
Yeah.
He's pleaded guilty to tax offences.
Yeah.
Which we heard in court related to documents found in the house up in Blackrock.
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't, because there was a guilty plea, and then it'll come back for another day for sentencing.
Yeah.
So you don't hear the exact details. However, it's clear that he's pled guilty to having more money than,
or filing false tax returns or whatever.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's what you wonder, is it relating to this protection money that Jimmy Jr. was paying the Real IRA? That evidence that we heard in the special criminal court of $2,500 a week were being paid to the Real IRA, the court was told?
Well, we'll hear, I suppose, when he's sentenced, you will hear the details. However, he's admitted the offence. It's, again, it's a case coming before the special criminal court. And again, you see a relatively early guilty plea. And we've seen a lot of that, actually.
I've had so many queries, interested contacts from all sorts of parts of the world contacting me in relation to this, with the big question of why.
Yeah.
So why has a guy like Nathan Kinsella, with convictions for membership of an illegal organisation, Nathan Kinsella hasn't really had legitimate work for decades.
Yeah.
There was questions around, him living in that house, where the registered owner was Jerry McGreevy. I must check, actually, has that changed at all? Because certainly Kinsella was telling people he's trying to raise the funds to buy it.
Yeah.
So why have these charges been dropped to a much lesser offence? And we don't know at this point as we're recording this. But, in the meantime, there's lots of questions around this because, of course, Nathan Kinsella would know a lot of what happened around Mansfield, around that incredibly chaotic time. And investigations are ongoing into criminal offences carried out around that area to do with finances and to do with money laundering. So, you know what I mean, the sort of questions I'm being asked, and obviously...
Yeah.
we'll remain to see what happens with it. But the state don't often certainly bring in lesser charges. Of course, plea deals do happen, and they can, when they will accept a guilty plea and a lesser charge. But it seems to me a tax offence and a money laundering offence are at almost
but look,
different ends of the scale.
Look, we'll hear more. I mean, that's the truth of it. But it's Nathan Kinsella is another one who's another 15 years maybe he's been in the Sunday world, and
doesn't like being photographed.
No, he doesn't like being photographed.
But actually, he made a big mistake, an error in judgment. He went into the courts for the first few days with the thing on his face, those masks that we all used to wear, and he must have forgotten it because he's got, what did the photographer say that time? Make the fish. Didn't he get someone straight between the eyes?
Straight between the eyes.
Straight between the eyes with the photograph. So he was got straight between the eyes. He was walking out of court the other day. So
there's more to be seen. And it's the poor people of Blackrock.
But now they can see exactly, they can see the face of the individual that they have
sleep a bit better. Of course, the people in Dalkey it was like living in Gaza, was it?
I don't even want to talk about that. I can't believe somebody said that.
Probably should say what it was it?
Sorry, but it was I just read the headline. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. Somebody had stood up at a meeting to say that living in Dalkey was like being a Palestinian in the Gaza because of the traffic management. I mean, how could somebody just be so inappropriate?
Yeah.
It's not even funny. We shouldn't even be laughing at that because that's just ignorant to say that.
It is.
I mean, it's unreal. It follows, of course, from, if you remember, some years ago, there was a criminal offence committed in Dalkey one Christmas time, and a local resident said it was like
living in Aleppo.
Living in Aleppo, yeah.
Look, it's all a matter of perspective, isn't it?
Right, listen, I'm really interested to see what's going to happen with Nathan Kinsella, what evidence is going to come out at his sentencing. I see that's in January 2024, so I have a little bit of time to wait. But
thanks, Nicola.
Thanks, Niall.